And answering the question of whether clean energy can become India's biggest industrial policy, we are joined by Sumant Sinha, founder, chairman and CEO, ReNew.
And I'd also like to welcome Senior Executive Editor, Times Now, Madhavdas Gopal Krishnan, to join Mr. Sinha on stage as they explore India's clean energy policy. Let's give a big round of applause to our panelists here.
Thank you so much, Hina, as well as Ashish. And as we move on to, clean energy, we're talking about how India can have better energy sources, renewable energy sources. The focus also has to shift on how this can be done in an economically sustainable way and the economic impact of all of this, particularly in terms of creating jobs, creating new businesses. There are many aspects of this that we're going to be talking with Sumant Sinha, who's of course founder and chairman, as well as CEO of ReNew, where ReNew, of course, as we know, has multiple interests: solar, wind, battery storage, etc. Let me begin, Sumant, by asking you, with clean energy as a priority, are we now looking at it becoming an important cog as far as India's economic development is concerned because of the multiple areas where this is poised to grow in?
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me here. Pleasure to be here and sharing my thoughts with all of you. I think absolutely. It is very clear that if there are two things that are going to impact the future of any economy going forward, one is AI, we are all aware of that, and the second is energy. And for a country like India that does not have a lot of its own energy supply, energy security in today's geopolitical context is extremely important. And therefore, in that context, the thing that we can rely upon the most is clean energy, because we can make that within our borders. We can have the clean energy ecosystem and supply chain here. And so to me, it can become a very important part of India's economic development, and not just an important part, but a critical part driving the future of the country. And then if you think about different aspects of it, clean energy can become a sector where we can position ourselves in the global supply chain of clean tech as an alternative to China, right? So we don't have to just manufacture for ourselves. We can also manufacture for the rest of the world to some extent. And then secondly, we can use clean energy essentially to export energy. Now, what do I mean by that? We can export green fuels, which are made through clean energy. We can export compute capacity by setting up data centers which export their compute capacity outside of the country as well. So there are many things that we can do through the clean energy transition that can really fundamentally differently drive India's economic growth than what we have seen in the last several years.
Right. And what are the major policy interventions that have had an impact, whether we're talking about hydrogen, whether we're talking about clean energy, battery storage, etc.? What are the important policy interventions that we've had so far, and what more is needed in coming years?
It's a very important issue that you've raised, which is the issue of policy making in our sector. Ours is a sector which is evolving as we go forward. Technology is changing, geopolitics is changing, the country's needs are changing, there's economic growth happening which is requiring demand for new energy to come in. And within that context, policy making therefore becomes extremely important. Now, the good news is that so far, we have mostly got it right. Okay? What are the things that we've got right? Number one, setting a big target for renewable energy at a time when renewables were still more expensive, which I think was a very gutsy thing on the part of the government, and it was driven directly by the Prime Minister, right? So full marks to the government for having driven that vision. The second thing is, what are the policy interventions that they came up with? Number one was they created a single national grid that allowed the movement of power from anywhere to anywhere, which allowed us to export power from places like Rajasthan, where it's cheap to produce solar, to places in eastern India where otherwise it wouldn't have been possible to generate clean energy, right? So creating a national grid was very important. Then providing access to renewables into the national grid free of cost until very recently. I think that was also a path-breaking change that the government did to incentivize renewables. Thirdly, they created the Solar Energy Corporation of India, which essentially removed us from the credit risk of the DISCOMs. right? And also brought in transparency in the bidding process, which is a very significant move forward. Otherwise, you are dealing with all the different DISCOMs separately. The fourth thing that they did is that they also brought in a lot of grid management issues which were favorable to renewables. For example, giving renewables must-run status, being easy on the DSM, which is the forecasting requirement for renewables. So a lot of those kinds of things were done as well. So I would say that across the board, there were a lot of very useful things that were done that allowed renewables to become cheap for the end customer, which in the most cases was the DISCOM. Also, by the way, fostering the C&I business through open access policies, allowing us to sell directly to end customers. The point is the list is very long, and I can go on for a long time, but I won't do that. Suffice is to say that the government came out with a number of very positive steps that allowed renewables to grow substantially. Now, why do I say this is a very important issue that you've raised, and I'll take a little bit of time on this because it's very central, is because we are now again at an inflection point. The inflection point that we're at right now is twofold. Point number one is that renewables is already 15 to 20% in the grid. And when I say renewables, I mean wind and solar. Just to keep generating more renewable energy and dumping it into the grid is not going to work any longer. Because the grid is not able to absorb so much power. It's creating a lot of this duck curve problem, where you have too much power in the daytime and too little in the evening. And therefore prices go up very high in the evening and collapse in the daytime. Now our power is mostly sold under long-term contracts, so prices don't matter to us that much, but it's not a good signal of the fact that there's surplus and there's deficiency of power. So this problem needs to be addressed. It can be done through batteries, it can be done through better management of the grid. There are many solutions, but they have to be implemented. They should have got implemented 2 years ago, because after all the target was there, right? And suddenly if 1 year India gets close to achieving the target and gets onto that right trajectory, it should not have caused this problem. But it did, which means that we should have probably tackled this problem a couple of years ago or anticipated that this problem would happen. Right? So anyway, now we are moving at lightning pace to put in place batteries and storage, and all the right things are being done now. Right? So this is one inflection point. So we now start needing to look at the full cost of renewable energy in the grid, not just the cost of generation. That means include the cost of transmission, include the cost of storage.
Right.
Okay? That is very important. The good news, however, is that even when you do that, the cost of renewables with all of this done is still cheaper than the cost of thermal. So renewables, round-the-clock power, and all of those kinds of products, which by the way we pioneered, because we are the only company so far that has actually commissioned a round-the-clock power project and a peak power project, and we came up with this whole concept several years ago. You find that the cost is cheaper than coal. It's about 4.5 to 5 rupees.
Right.
Okay, so that's good news. But that is inflection point number one, that now we need to solve this legacy problem that has arisen, and for the future we need to do things very differently.
Right.
Okay, so for which we need policies to be rightly done and put in place quickly.
I have a question, because you mentioned battery and how important it is to ensure that there's seamless supply of power. You know, one of the things that you talk about, when you talk about EVs or you talk about batteries, generally speaking, we all know that China has a dominance over the entire supply chain as far as provision of these batteries are concerned. So how do we balance those Atmanirbharta concerns also, at the same time looking at our economy and also ensuring that we are competitive and we're able to cater to our own needs? What is the way future?
Yeah, so this is obviously leading to my second inflection point, which is exactly this point, that we cannot trade dependence on, let's say, the Middle East for oil to China for the clean energy supply chain. That is not going to work in today's geopolitics, right? That is very clear. And so therefore, the government has to find ways of fostering a clean energy supply chain in India, while at the same time making sure that installations don't fall off a cliff because now suddenly we're changing supply chains.
So how do we do that?
So now this is an important issue, because see, we've done it quite successfully in the case of solar modules and solar cells, and we're about to replicate that for wafers as well. And here, you see, you have to think about it the following way. The government has fundamentally two policy levers that they've used so far to encourage domestic manufacturing across sectors. One is PLI, which we are all familiar with, and the other is, in our sector, ALMM, Approved List of Models and Manufacturers, right? Which essentially, the ALMM really has meant a certification requirement which has created a bit of a hard wall towards imports. Now, what that has resulted in is the fact that in solar modules, we now have almost 2.5 times the capacity that we require domestically. Because, it was an attractive market, everybody came in, there was, once the Chinese imports were stopped, it became attractive for domestic manufacturers. So it led to the creation of a lot of capacity, in fact, a lot of overcapacity now. The same thing is going to happen to cells and eventually to wafers as well, because the government has given those timelines. And the way they've done it is by giving a 2-year notice period, saying 2 years from now, I'm going to stop this, imports, but I'm also going to grandfather everything that has been bid out until then. So at least the existing installations don't get impacted.
Right.
And that has worked very well.
Right.
So we have to do the same thing for different parts of the clean tech supply chain. We should have done it for batteries some time back. But I think the government is toggling between the PLI scheme and the LMM scheme. And I have specific views on which I think works better. But I think the government has to come to its own conclusion.
Do let us know which works better in your experience.
Look, I think that for a variety of reasons, the LMM scheme works better because it gives a better, clearer, more predictable signal to the corporate sector. It allows anybody and everybody to get in. And it creates a level playing field between domestic manufacturers. In a PLI scheme, there are necessarily winners of the PLI. And therefore, those necessary winners end up having an advantage over everybody else domestically. And it is also not clear that the PLI is sufficient to protect from Chinese imports. So very often, by the time you get to the PLI, it's the fact is that nobody is able to get it, or it is designed in a way that does not lead to final investments happening because the Chinese have undercut prices even more. So those are things that ultimately the government has to do its own study, come to its own conclusion, and then for batteries, for example, is the question that you asked. That kind of a scheme, the LMM kind of a scheme works better. And so I think those are the kinds of decisions that need to be taken to really create the supply chain in India. Now, it's never too late to do that. And I think the sooner we can get started, the better.
Now, specifically speaking, you've already spoken about how you sort of expect 47% of our fossil fuel, as a source of our energy to come down drastically. What makes you confident that we'll be able to achieve such a huge target? 47% is a huge number. And what are the specific areas through which we can achieve that kind of a target in your view?
See, there are two things that we have to do. One is today, electricity accounts for only 20% of energy in India. In the Western world, the number is about 28%. In China, it's getting close to 30%. The Western world, by the way, has tapped out at about 27, 28% of electricity as a function of energy for the last many years, right? So they seem to be hitting a wall. Now, first thing is we need to electrify everything. We need to electrify transportation, for example. Why don't we have more electric vehicles? If importing fossil fuels, every time there is a spike in oil prices, causes our rupee to fall and a lot of other inflationary consequences as a result, then we should have very clear policies to shift to electric vehicles or biofuel, vehicles as quickly as possible. So that transition, for example, needs to happen quickly. That will bring down the demand for fossil fuels, right? Two, on the electricity side, we need to decarbonize by moving forward on clean energy and battery-based solutions. Also things like nuclear. Also things like geothermal, for example, or it could be any other form of clean energy, right? So that we don't make our environment and climate problem worse than it is right now. So all of those have to be pursued, and they can be pursued. So if you look at Niti Aayog's roadmap to net zero by 2070, they are saying that electrification, which is currently 20%, needs to by 2050 go up to 40% and almost 70% by 2070. So they've created a roadmap to get there. So we need to electrify and we have to clean the electricity supply. If we can do both together, which now there are solutions that are possible, then we will start going down the pathway of reducing our fossil fuel consumption. The second thing we need to do is we need to really look at the areas where the hard to abate sectors, which are by definition called hard to abate for a reason because they are difficult to address. Those are areas that we need to address. We need to have more green hydrogen, green ammonia, instead of make more green urea, for example. Now, we are setting up a lot of steel. We are doubling our steel capacity in the next 10, 15 years.
Right.
Now, 2/3 of that steel capacity is meant to come from blast furnaces. Now, that consumes coal. That should not be allowed. We should be going for electric arc furnaces. So there are lots of things like that we need to do on the user industry side, so that we convert more and more energy into electricity or make it cleaner. Even if it's consuming fuels, we can make it green fuels. So on the demand side, we need to do a lot of work now. So I would say, if you ask me honestly, the easy lifting is done in the clean energy transition. The tougher job really starts now, where it goes from being a niche sector within electricity to becoming a much broader based sector which spans the entire economic paradigm of the country.
Right.
And it requires a whole of the government approach now, rather than the approach of only one or two ministries.
Right.
That is really the transition that we now need to make, and that is the inflection point that we're at.
Right. We had Minister Prahlad Joshi here this morning, and he told us that we are at around 300 gigawatts in terms of, capacity as far as renewable energy is concerned. We are third in the world after US and China. Now, I have two questions. You partially answered this, but I have two questions taking forward from the thoughts that you just expressed. What makes you confident, A, that we'll be able to quickly beat US and China? We clearly need to be number one if we have to anywhere achieve the targets that have been set. And what can we learn from their experiences as far as renewable energy is concerned?
So, taking a step back, you mentioned USA and China. The US and China are taking fundamentally different approaches to the energy situation in the future. The reason is that the US has fossil fuels, and they've become the world's biggest producer of fossil fuels. So they are doubling down, as we know, under Trump on fossil fuels. So they are saying we're going to do more and more fossil fuels, and they are trying to get other countries in the world to buy their fossil fuel from them, and they're going after Venezuela, Iran, etc., right, with a view to controlling the whole fossil fuels framework, right? China, on the other hand, prescient of them, but they probably saw their reliance on fossil fuels 25, 30 years ago. Okay, credit to them for that. And they decided to convert their economy as far as possible towards clean energy. And not just build clean energy capacity, but also build clean energy supply chains and further backward integrate into critical minerals and rare earths, and then get the capital equipment manufacturing industries as well, and get the R&D as well. So now they've got to a point where they've got the whole backward supply chain, right? And so they are going down the electricity future path, whereas the US is going down the fossil fuel path. Which path is India going to follow? We don't have fossil fuels. So there's no choice for us but to follow the China path. Unfortunately, China is already ahead of us by many, many decades in that path. So we need to play catch up, and we need to do that very, very, very smartly. And it requires a very collaborative approach between government and the corporate sector, because we need to do it together. Government needs to make policies, we need to make the investments, and the good news is that there is that collaboration that is happening. So I'm hopeful that even though we may not be able to catch up to China in the short sort of period of time, because they're far away ahead of us, but we can certainly be number two compared to anybody else in the world. And we are certainly almost there right now.
But our problems are very similar to China. We have extremely crowded city, density of population, we have pollution in our cities. All of these are things that we've seen China also sort of battle through and come through. So what's the way forward if you can't replicate China when it comes to electric vehicles, electric sources of energy and other clean sources? What exactly is the way for India's future when it comes to clean energy, particularly mobility?
No, we have to go down that same path because of all the reasons that you mentioned. We have bad pollution, environmental issues are pretty not great. So climate change, of course, is a problem for the whole world, as it is for India. We know that we're a vulnerable country as far as climate change is concerned. So, but leave all that aside. The fact is, we have to develop the supply chains on the clean energy side. We have to roll out on clean energy because as a country, we don't have a choice. We have to go down that path. And so what if China is ahead of us? We can certainly be the plus one to China. Right, and position ourselves as the alternative country, and we have to work on our trade policies with other countries to make sure that they buy clean tech equipment from us for diversification purposes for their own supply chains. So we need to do all of that, right? And if we do all of that, we'll address some of these environmental pollution issues as well, and we'll eventually be the second biggest country on the clean tech side.
Right.
So I think there's nothing wrong with that, just because another country is ahead of us.
Oh, absolutely, and if we can generate jobs, then definitely it's something we should encourage. But I want to take you up, we're almost out of time, on one of the things that you've been quoted as saying, you've talked about achieving zero solid waste to landfill by 2030. Now, is this really possible in India? Because we have something like 9 million tons of plastic waste that we generate annually. We are also called the world's biggest plastic polluter. We're sitting in the national capital region where there are, mountains of garbage sitting at our borders. How do we resolve all this? Is this really something that we can achieve in such a short time?
So look, I don't know, because time obviously is passing every day, and some of these issues need to get addressed almost immediately. Look, I think a lot of it depends ultimately on policy making and what incentives policymakers give to the corporate sector to solve some of these problems. I think a lot of issues can be solved if we all work together to do that. For example, as I was talking earlier about the supply chain, I mean, the fact that we have now 170, 180 gigawatts of module manufacturing capacity, who could have envisaged that literally 2 years ago? And by the way, we have the third or fourth largest manufacturing capacity as well in solar, as ReNew, as a company.
Right, right. But this solid waste, how will it be managed in your view? Okay, what is the solution to this?
Look, there are technologies available where you can actually generate energy from solid waste, right? Through mechanisms of burning it in certain specially designed kilns and furnaces and so on. So solutions are there. As I said, they just have to be implemented. And the question is, again, what kind of tariff will you give to the guys who are going to do this? You know, if they generate power from doing all of that, how will you buy their power, you know, at what prices and so on?
Right. Sumant Sinha, thank you so much for taking the time out and speaking to us over here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Sinha, and thank you, Madhav, so much for the riveting conversation around clean energy.